Checkmated them. That's how good
Control
I
the
am at
center,
chess.
and
Look,
you can control the game.
I had that there to
We may have
defend
heard that
that,
it's
so it
important to
can't
control the center
take it
and
right
develop
there.
our piece.
There, and the queen was closest, and he didn't even think about moving another piece for defense or moving his rook. That's why rooks are actually pretty important. So then right here, I had him trapped right here, as you can see, which I found pretty neat. Yeah. Rainer, you said hi again. Hi, Rainer. I want to practice some stuff. Martin. I have more elo score than Martin, but they say that Martin is actually like crazy. Mr. Beast? I can play chess against Mr. Beast? Top players. Okay. Meow. Let's... no. No. I'm just reading. Alright. Meow, I saw how popular this cat got, so now I'm a cat. Hee hee. Okay, no, that's... I'm gonna destroy you. Meow, you must not fear. Feel like the mind killer. Hee hee. There. Fortnite. No, I heard that's a severe case of Fortnite. Bud. That's smart of yours. But he does have one elo score. It's crazy. Guy's actually good at chess. This is bot with one elo score. No, probably got me because of my blunder. I got
As you continue your chess journey, the starting position in front of us is going to be very familiar to you. But how often do you think about the board without any pieces? When you take a look at a blank chessboard, what comes to mind for you? Do you consider it a canvas with unlimited potential, the beauty just waiting to be discovered? Or perhaps you see 64 squares, 32 light and 32 dark. It's very important to become familiar with the chessboard. Specifically,
see.
the chessboard looks flat, and all the squares appear the same, but not all squares are created equally. Consider the center squares e4, d4, d5, and e5. These squares are the chess mountain, the highest point on the chessboard. You want to make sure you have your fair share of the chess mountain, or inner center, and the best way to do that is planting flags, or pawns, in the center of the board. You're claiming e4 as your territory on the mountain. Black will often play e5, doing the same thing. The squares surrounding the chess mountain, or inner center, is what we call the outer center. You can consider the outer center as the chess hill, not as high as the chess mountain, but still elevated above all the other squares. When we think about developing our pieces, think about the chess mountain and hill, or inner center and outer center. We want to develop our forces to help control these critical squares. Now that we have a general idea of where we want to place our pieces, let's return White's pieces to the starting squares. Let's pretend for a moment that we can only move 2 pawns and the rest of our pieces only once. Where would you develop your forces? Thinking about the chess mountain, or inner center, we don't have to hesitate to play e4 and d4. Knights love to jump into the outer center and help control the key central squares with knight f3 and knight c3. Bishops love open diagonals, so bishop c4 and bishop f4 are natural squares for these pieces. Take a look at all of the squares these bishops control in enemy territory. Castling has a very important role in our development. For this exercise, let's consider castling as the king move. White's king wisely evacuates the center and now has 3 loyal pawns protecting it. Castling also allows us to bring our rook into the action, especially helping control the center, with a move like rook e1. Now we only have our queen and rook on a1 to move. White's queen can be well placed on e2 or d2. Let's move the queen to d2. Now White's rooks are connected, and White's queen backs up the dark squared bishop, supercharging that diagonal. Finally, we would complete our development with rook a to d1. Notice our 2 central pawns, knights, and bishops are all in the inner and outer center. White's major pieces, the queen and 2 rooks, help support the center, so in the future, White can start advancing pawns up the board. Of course, this is only a dream scenario, and our opponent certainly has something to say about this. So what does a position look like when both sides are following this strategy, activating their pieces and controlling these key squares? Let's take a look. This is a very typical opening position, and notice the balance of the forces. Both sides have pawns in the inner center, controlling their fair share of space. Both sides have castled their king to safety, and the knights and bishops are all controlling key squares in the center. With all this in mind, let's have some fun and see development in action.
Oh yeah, then I can check them. Ooh.
How important is it to develop
Yeah,
our
let's try
pieces to
this.
safe, active squares where they work together in harmony? When one side follows this advice and the other side ignores it, we'll soon
Let's
find an
freaking
answer.
sh-
After e4, e5, knight f3, White combines development with attack. Black's most popular and flexible move is knight c6, developing a piece toward the center and protecting the e5 pawn. Instead, Black plays d6. Is this a good move for Black? It depends on which bishop you ask. Black's light-squared bishop enjoys a newly opened diagonal, but Black's dark-squared bishop isn't exactly thrilled that it's blocked by its own pawn on d6 and cannot enter the action in the center. Although this move isn't bad, Black's dark-squared bishop will have to accept a more passive role than we would prefer. White's bishop on the king side has no such worries after bishop c4, where it controls key central squares and is pointing directly at Black's weak f7 pawn. Black decides to develop the knight on b8. What is the best square for this piece? If Black plays knight a6, when a knight moves to the edge of the board, a famous saying is, a knight on the rim is dim. Black's knight only controls 4 squares, and none of them are squares in the inner center. Let's compare the last move with knight c6. Developing the knight toward the center with knight c6 is the best square for this piece. It controls both e5 and d4, key central squares, and controls a total of 8 squares, twice as many as it controlled on the edge of the board. Black selected a third option and played knight d7. The knight only protects the e5 square in the center, so it's less active, and now Black's light-squared bishop cannot move. White continues to demonstrate positive development with knight c3. And once again, black makes a passive knight move with knight e7. Instead of working together, black's pieces are standing in each other's way. Notice that both of black's bishops cannot move, which means the knights would have to move again in order to free the natural diagonals for the bishops, wasting more time. Time is not on black's side, and white punishes black's poor development immediately with knight g5. Notice how white's pieces are working together. The knight on g5 joins the light-squared bishop in attacking the weak f7 pawn. White's knight on c3 and pawn on e4 join the light-squared bishop in protecting the key d5 square, which means if black plays the best move in a bad position, d5, white can simply capture the pawn and win material. Instead of blocking this dangerous diagonal with d5, black decides to play f6, turning the position from bad to completely losing. What would you play as white? You may notice that the queen on d8 is trapped, so you could actually win this piece with knight e6 or knight f7. But is there an even stronger move to play? If you found bishop f7, checkmate. Great job. The king cannot capture the bishop as it's protected by the knight on g5. Black's pieces smother its own king, so it's game over. Now that you've learned the importance of developing your pieces rapidly toward key central squares and using your pieces to work together as a team, you're ready to show off your skills in the challenges. Castle early and castle often. It's a funny but also helpful phrase to remember during your games. After 3 moves, white is a pawn in the center and developed a knight and bishop toward the center. What's next? It's never too early to make sure your king is safe, so a great move for white is to castle. Remember, this is the one time you can move two pieces at once. You move your king 2 squares, and then the rook moves next to your king, like this. Think of castling as building a house for your king. The king finds shelter behind 3 loyal pawns. So it isn't easy for your opponent to tear down your defenses. The other great thing about castling is it answers a question you might be wondering. How do I bring my rooks into the game? Castling allows your rook to move toward the center, where it can enter the action. If you were black in this position, what would your plan be? Castle early and castle often. How can black prepare castling? That's right. Let's move our knight into the action and control the center with knight f6. Preparing to castle and threatening white's pawn on e4. After white protects the e4 pawn with a move such as d3, the house has been built for black's king. Let's move it in with castling. Both sides have safe kings thanks to castling, and each of the rooks used for castling are excited to enter the game in the center. Is castling really that important? Since our opening strategy should be to control the center, actively develop our pieces to help support the center, and castle our king to safety, we definitely do not want our king to sit in the center of the board where most of the action usually takes place. In this position, white is castled, but black's king is sitting on a central file which is wide open. With white to move, we can see our rook enter the action with rook e1 check. Rooks love open files, especially files leading to the enemy king. Notice black's king cannot escape the center, as white's bishop controls its escape square. Black could block the check with the bishop, but white would simply capture that bishop, and once again black's king would be in check. Black's only other move is queen e7, blocking the check, but now black's queen is in danger. Since white has 2 attackers, the bishop and rook, and black only has 1 defender of the queen, the king, white can play rook takes e7 check, winning black's queen and checking black's king. Notice black's king cannot capture the rook, as then black's king would be in check. Black would love to castle the king to safety, but since you can't castle out of check, black has to settle for a move such as king d8. Notice black's rooks are not connected, so they cannot work together, and black is down an entire queen. Now that we learned how much rooks love castling as they can enter the action in the center, would you believe white has an even stronger way to take advantage of black's exposed king? Instead of winning the queen with the awesome rook check, we can actually checkmate black's king in the center of the board. How is this possible? Our path to victory begins with delivering a check with our most powerful piece, queen to e2 check. Once again, black's king cannot move as white's bishop prevents its escape, so after queen e7, using our queen as an attacker with the bishop as a helper, we can play queen takes e7, checkmate, capturing black's queen, attacking the king, and covering all of the escape squares. The bishop is the helper piece because it protects white's queen, meaning that black cannot capture the queen, so the game is over. Let's look at one last example together. Sometimes we do our best to castle early, and it just doesn't work out as planned. Don't worry, it happens to all of us. The most important thing is not to dwell on the past, but focus on what you can do now and build a better future. White is down a pawn, and black is threatening to capture our rook on h1. To make matters worse, our king is still in the center, and black's rook that was used for castling is lined up with our king. Not a good sign. What is white to do? How can we move our king to safety and protect our rook on h1 at the same time? That's right, we can castle queenside. Our king has escaped the dangers of the center, and now the rooks are connected, protecting each other on the first rank. White's position isn't perfect, but it's a lot better now that we've castled. You've done a great job exploring the importance of protecting our king by castling. Now let's castle early and often in the challenges. Winning a chess game isn't something you can simply make happen. There is no outright winning strategy or forced win. If you simply hope that your opponent will do all of the work for you and make a blunder, you won't win as many games and you won't get very good. The only way to win at chess is by playing with sound strategies and gradually making your position better until you have an overwhelming advantage or your opponent can't handle the pressure and cracks. The key to improving your position is making your pieces active. An active piece is one that is full of potential and ready to jump into action. When you start a game of chess, none of your pieces are active. Most of your pieces can't even move. Your job is to get your pieces into the game and put them on active squares where they can attack, defend, and improve your control of the board. Let's take a look at a few positions and compare who has more active pieces. Let's start by looking at some opening moves and see which side does a better job activating their pieces. White begins the game with e4, controlling the center and already opening up lines for the light-squared bishop and queen. Black plays h6. This pawn controls g5 but does nothing to help with development. White plays knight f3. The knight activates toward the center, controlling the d4 and e5 central squares. Black plays knight a6, developing a piece, but unlike White's last knight move to f3, Black's knight on a6 does not control the center and only controls 4 squares, b4, c5, c7, and b8. Let's compare that to the knight on f3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 total squares, or twice as many as the knight on a6 controls. That's why it's important to develop toward the center. White follows this advice with bishop to c4, controlling the center and placing pressure on Black's weakest point, the f7 square. Notice White is ready to castle on the very next turn. Black plays h5, moving the h-pawn for a second time, which does not control any central squares and wastes time that could have been used to develop a piece. White castles the king to safety and brings the rook toward the center. Black places a second knight to the edge of the board, reducing its square control again to only 4 squares, just like the knight on a6. White activates the rook with rook e1. The rook enjoys open lines in the center of the board. Notice the rook can help support the e-pawn's advance up the board in the future. Taking a look at White's position, you can notice that White has placed a pawn in the center, has developed pieces to active squares that help control the center, and White has also castled the king to safety. Black, on the other hand, does not control any of the key central squares, has 2 knights on the edge of the board, and Black has not moved any pawns that would allow the bishops and queen to enter the game. White's position is far more active. Let's take a look at another position. Take a moment and compare White and Black's pieces. Which side has more active pieces? White or Black? Let's first look at White's pieces. Notice that White has 3 pieces in Black's territory: the bishop on f6, the knight on d6, and the rook on c7. All of these pieces are very active. The bishop on f6 controls a lot of key squares right in front of Black's king, and notice the bishop controls the entire a1 to h8 diagonal. This bishop also controls h4 to d8, controlling a lot of dark squares right in Black's territory. The knight on d6 is excellently placed. It's putting pressure on f7, b7, and the bishop on c8. Notice White's rook on c7 is doing the same thing, pressurizing all 3 of these targets as well. The only piece that's not in Black's territory is the rook on d1, and it enjoys a lot of open squares and also protects the knight on d6. Let's compare that with Black's pieces. Black has no pieces in White's territory, and notice Black has 3 pieces still on the 8th rank: the rook on a8, the bishop on c8, and the rook on f8. The only piece not on the back rank is the knight on h6, stuck in the corner. Notice the knight cannot move to f5 or g4 because White has pawns that would capture that knight. Black's pieces are basically paralyzed. Take a look at the light-squared bishop on c8. It has one square, d7, and it's already protected by the white rook. The black rook on f8 cannot move to e8 because of the knight, or d8 without getting captured by the bishop. The only piece that can move without getting captured is the rook on a8, and it can only move to b8, where it's not really doing much. So to take a look at this position, we can say white has very active pieces and black has very inactive pieces. Let's take a look at one more position. Finally, in this position, is it clear which side has more active pieces? Let's take a look. Notice that both sides have pawns directly in the center, d4 and d5. Both sides have very active bishops. They both control kingside and queenside space. Both sides have queens directly behind those bishops, controlling good diagonals on the king side as well as queen side, and they're well placed in the center of the board. Notice both sides have rooks on the c-file, enjoying a lot of open squares. The only difference between the two sides is the rook on e1 for white has the e-file all to itself. Meanwhile, the rook on f8 isn't really doing that much for black. So black solves this by playing rook f to e8. Both sides have very active pieces. We would call this an even or balanced position. Now that you've learned how to identify active versus inactive pieces, it's your turn to practice activating your pieces. As you continue on your chess journey, it's a great feeling when you start to win more games and notice that you are making stronger moves. If you really want to take your game to the next level, it's essential to start thinking about your opponent's moves and truly understanding their ideas before deciding on your own move. The most obvious idea behind an opponent's move is a check. such as queen b1, delivering a check to our king. Since our king is under attack, it's easy to react instantly and play king h2. Unfortunately, if we play too quickly, we risk missing the entire story behind our opponent's move. Before responding, try to understand all of the things your opponent's move does. Yes, black's queen checked white's king, but was that the only purpose of the move? Notice black's queen was also attacking the unprotected bishop, so black can play queen takes b5. Black is no longer down a piece and has a good position. Let's take a look at this position again. Now that we understand that black's queen is attacking both our king and unprotected bishop, known as a double attack, is there a way we can both block the check and protect our bishop? If you found bishop f1, great job. We block the check and protect our bishop at the same time, so white is up a piece and enjoys a great position. Now let's take our game to the next level and start to think seriously about our opponent's moves and ideas in the following examples. In this position, after black plays knight b4, instead of immediately focusing on what we should do, let's make sure we understand the point behind black's last move. When a knight begins to jump, we want to carefully consider where it may land. Knight takes a2 looks pointless because we can simply capture it with our rook. Where else is the knight attacking? That's right, the pawn on c2. Notice that black's bishop on f5 is also attacking that pawn. A common mistake is to understand that our pawn is under attack and then decide to move it with c3, attacking black's knight and moving the pawn to safety. How could this be a mistake? Unfortunately, the knight wasn't just attacking the pawn, it was also attacking the c2 square. So black can play knight c2 check, forking white's king and rook on a1. White should make the best out of a bad situation and move the king, because if white plays queen takes c2, black wins a queen for a knight with bishop takes c2. Let's take a second look at this position and try to find a better option for white. Since black has two pieces attacking the c2 square, and we only have one defender, the queen, what should we do about this threat? If we play e4, trying to block the black bishop's diagonal, black will simply capture the pawn with the bishop, and we still have to solve our main problem, the weak c2 square. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like more time to think about the position. If you found the defensive resource knight a3, great job. We don't usually like moving our knight to the edge of the board where it controls fewer squares, but this inconvenience is easier to accept than losing a serious amount of material. Now that c2 is properly protected, we're ready to kick the knight out of our territory with c3. And if black plays knight takes c2 check, as long as we capture with our least valuable defender first with knight takes c2, bishop takes c2, and queen takes c2, after all of the trades, white is up an extra bishop for a pawn, so black should have spent more time thinking about the consequences of our knight a3 move before capturing the c2 pawn. Let's continue to work on understanding the ideas behind our opponent's moves. In this position, white decides to play queen f6. Take a moment to understand all of the ideas behind white's last move. You may notice black's rook on d8 is under attack. So with that information in mind, black may play rook e8, moving the rook to safety and adding a second attacker to the e4 pawn. Before deciding on our move, don't forget to ask, what are all of the ideas behind my opponent's last move? It is true that white's queen attacks 3 pawns, but none of these moves look very good. Remember to always look for checks and captures. In this case, white can win the game immediately with queen g7. Checkmate. After carefully considering all of the ideas behind our opponent's last move, how can we both prevent checkmate and protect our rook on d8? It might not look possible, but your knight on c5 is ready to come to the rescue. Where can you move your knight to stay in the game? That's right, you can play knight e6. This move prevents checkmate on g7, as the knight would simply capture the queen, and it also protects the rook on d8. Knight e6 isn't the first move that may come to mind, but by taking the time to fully understand the ideas behind your opponent's move, we can find these important resources. Sometimes you can make a threat and it seems like your opponent is completely ignoring you. If white plays rook to f1, we may expect black to play rook f8 to protect the hanging pawn on f7. It may come as a surprise to see black play rook to d8. This move seems to completely ignore our threat of rook takes f7. Of course, sometimes your opponent only focuses on their own moves and misses the purpose behind your moves. If you don't see a point behind your opponent's last move, you need to trust yourself and continue with your plan. If it turns out you overlooked a tactic, you will gain a valuable lesson, but you cannot fear threats that you do not see. It turns out that rook d8, lining up with our king, is a very tricky way to defend the f7 pawn. So white should move the king off of the same file as black's rook with a move such as king c4. After rook takes f7, black has a surprising move which wins white's rook. Take a moment to look for this incredible resource. If you found the powerful move knight e5 check, excellent job. The pawn on d4 cannot capture the knight, as it would put our own king in check, which is illegal. And after white moves the king to safety with a move such as king e2, black wins the rook with knight takes f7. Let's take a look at one more example together. Chess is such a beautiful game as there are so many layers to discover. In this position, black plays knight takes b3. What is the point of this move? It looks like black is simply offering a trade of pieces. One way to help improve your game is to ask yourself every time your opponent makes a move, if my opponent had another move, what would they play? We might assume black would simply move the knight to safety and be up a piece. If white doesn't think carefully about this question and simply plays a takes b3, white is in for a rude awakening. When you ask, if my opponent had another move, what would they play? Always look at every single check and capture your opponent can play, because these are the moves that may cost you the game, as in this case, with queen c1. Checkmate. Since black's threat is queen c1 checkmate, you might make a quick decision and play a move like g3, opening up an escape square for your king. Before deciding to not recapture black's knight and accept being down a piece, is there another way to capture black's knight and prevent checkmate? c1, as we would simply capture the queen. You've done an excellent job working through one of the most important skills to develop, always looking out for your opponent's moves and making sure you understand the ideas hidden behind them. Now let's stay alert and remain one step ahead of our opponent's moves and the challenges. Knowing the rules of chess is just the beginning. Chess is an incredibly deep game that you can spend a lifetime learning. So let's get started. Once you make your first move on the chessboard, you have entered what is called the opening phase of the game. This is where you begin to develop your pieces onto good squares where they can attack, defend, and control the center. Once most pieces have developed, the game enters the middle game phase, where both players are making plans, organizing their pieces, finding weaknesses, and attacking their opponent's king. Some games end right in the middle game with checkmate or resignation, like in this position. After queen e4, white creates a battery with the queen and bishop on the b1 to h7 diagonal, threatening checkmate. Notice the queen is also threatening the unprotected rook on a8. Black only notices the unprotected rook, moves it to safety, and then is shocked to see the game is over. Queen takes h7, checkmate. Not all games end that quickly. Some games continue on, and after many of the pieces have been traded away, enter the endgame phase, where the goal is usually to promote a pawn to a queen and then checkmate your opponent. In these lessons, you will learn about each of these phases of the game in detail so you can improve your chances of winning. But before we get too far, it's time to talk about your first moves in the opening. There are three main goals in the opening. First is to establish control of the center. The center is the most important part of the board. From the center, you can launch an attack anywhere. Second is to get your pieces onto active squares. They don't have many options when they're stuck on the back rank where they start, so bringing them into the game toward the center is a good idea. Third is to get your king to safety by castling, so the king is not exposed to the dangers of the battle in the center. All of your opening moves should support these goals. Now it's your turn to practice making great opening moves. Some people with a little experience in chess may have heard of the famous four-move checkmate. For a beginner, this can sound both exciting and scary. Who wouldn't want to win in 4 moves? And of course, nobody wants to lose in 4 moves. Luckily, the four-move checkmate is only dangerous in name. If you know what you're doing, that is. The four-move checkmate is a fast attack that develops some pieces very quickly toward the center and the enemy king. White typically opens the game with e4, controlling the center and opening lines for the light square bishop and queen. Black responds with e5, controlling the center and opening up lines. And after bishop to c4, white quickly brings the bishop to an active diagonal, controlling the center and pointing at the weak f7 square. Notice the f7 square is only protected by black's king. Black typically plays knight to c6, making a sensible developing move, or sometimes will play bishop to c5. In either case, white has the option of the aggressive queen to h5, joining the bishop in the attack against the key f7 square. If black isn't careful, white will deliver checkmate on the very next move. Knight f6 is a very common mistake. Black moves the knight toward the center and threatens to win the queen. What could possibly be wrong with this move? Unfortunately, it forces the white queen to move exactly where it wanted to go, the f7 square, and deliver checkmate. You'll notice that the black king has nowhere to run. Black also can't block the check as the queen is literally touching the king. Notice black has no piece to capture the queen, and the king cannot capture the queen, because then the light square bishop would capture the king, and that's not allowed. This is the 4-move checkmate. Now let's go back and see how black could have avoided this unfortunate end to the game. After the moves e4, e5, bishop c4, knight c6, and queen h5, black must block the f7 square. The best way to do this is by playing g6. It attacks the queen, and it prevents the queen from capturing f7. White retreats the queen, but don't celebrate too early. The white queen refocuses its attack on the f7 square, threatening checkmate on the very next turn. Black can once again block the queen's path to the f7 square and develop a piece at the same time with knight f6. Notice if white tried to capture the knight, black would recapture and win the queen. At this point, black is safe and white has wasted some time running around with the queen. Finally, we have one more aggressive idea to be prepared for when our opponent tries to win the game with the 4-move checkmate. After e4, e5, white does not have to play bishop to c4 on the next turn. White could play the more aggressive queen h5. White threatens the weakened f7 square and threatens to win the e5 pawn with check. Remember, it's very important to defend the e5 pawn first and only then block the queen's attack on the f7 square. The best move for black is knight c6, developing a piece toward the center and protecting the e5 pawn. After bishop to c4, white's bishop joins the attack on the f7 square. Do you remember how black can best block the f7 square and attack the queen? That's right, g6. White sets up another checkmate with queen f3, threatening to take on f7. Do you remember how to block the second checkmate attack? That's right, knight to f6. Now that you've learned what the 4-move checkmate is, it's time to see what you've learned.